most important scientists and discoveries of the 20th century that you may never have heard of. Kristian Birkland. Kristian Olaf Bernhard Birkland, 13th of December 1867 to June 15th, 1917, was a Norwegian scientist who has been called the first space scientist and the father of plasma experiments in the laboratory and space. He is perhaps most well known for his scientific work on the aurora, using a torella, a magnetized globe, and as inventor of an electromagnetic cannon and a method of electrically producing artificial fertilizer. He also became a full professor of physics at the University of Oslo at the age of 31. Birkland also had astrophysical research published on cathode rays, the zodiacal lights, comets, the sun and sunspots, the origin of planets and their satellites, the Earth's magnetism. Some of Birkland's other contributions to science included: derived the general expression for the Poynting vector, gave the first general solution to Maxwell's equations, pioneered the field of charged particle beams, utilized the concept of longitudinal mass, constructed the first foil diodes, pioneered the field of visible light photography of electrical discharges, advocated charged particle propulsion engines for space travel, created Norsk Hydro's nitrogen fertilizer industry, the Birkelandite method for production of potassium nitrate, pioneered the field of visible light photography of electrical discharges, advocated charged particle propulsion engines for space travel. This guy's no joke. Created Norsk Hydro's nitrogen fertilizer industry, invented an electromagnetic railgun capable of firing a 10-kilogram projectile, established Birkland's Firearms Company, anticipated cosmic rays, discovered in 1911. With his calculations involving energies of several billion electron volts, held patents on the electromagnetic cannon, electric blankets, solid margarine, and hearing aids. In 1969, when field-aligned currents had been identified in the Earth's atmosphere, they were named in his honor, Birkland currents. In 1913, Birkland may have been the first to predict that plasma was ubiquitous in space. He wrote, "It seems to be a natural consequence of our points of view to assume that the whole of space is filled with electrons and flying electric ions of all kinds. We have assumed that each stellar system in evolutions throws off electric corpuscles into space. It does not seem unreasonable, therefore, to think that the greater part of the material masses in the universe is found, not in the solar systems or nebulae, but in empty space." In 1916, Birkland was probably the first person to successfully predict that solar wind behaves as do all charged particles in an electric field. From a physical point of view, it is most probable that these new solar rays are neither exclusively negative nor positive rays, but of both kinds. In other words, the solar wind consists of both negative electrons and positive ions. Field-aligned Birkland currents. See also on Possible Electric Phenomena in Solar Systems and Nebulae by Kristian Birkland. Birkland suggested that polar electric currents, today referred to as the auroral electrojets, were connected to a system of currents that flowed along geomagnetic field lines into and away from the polar region. He provided a diagram of field-aligned currents in his book, The Norwegian Aurora Polaris Expedition, 1902 and 1903. This diagram is reproduced on the back of the banknote in the lower right corner. This book contains chapters on magnetic storms on the Earth and their relationship to the Sun, the origin of the Sun itself, comets, and the rings of Saturn. Birkland's vision of field-aligned currents became the source of a controversy that continued for a quarter of a century. because their existence could not be confirmed from ground-based measurements alone. Yeah, neither can black holes. They say they exist. The absolute proof of Birkland's field-aligned currents could only come from observations made above the ionosphere and satellites. A magnetometer on board a U.S. Navy navigation satellite launched in 1963 observed magnetic disturbances on nearly every pass over the high latitude regions of the Earth. The magnetic disturbances were originally interpreted as hydromagnetic waves, but it was soon realized that they were due to field-aligned or Birkland currents. The first complete map of the statistical location of Birkland currents in the Earth's polar region was developed in 1974 by A.J. Shimoda and J.C. Armstrong and refined in 1976 from satellite-borne magnetic field observations. The ring encircling the magnetic pole depicted on the back of the banknote is similar to the patterns of Birkland and current derived from satellites. Birkland's face appears a second time in a watermark in the blank space above the drawing of the Torella, and his rudimentary magnetosphere appears on the back, but is only visible under ultraviolet light. Yeah, he's quite a smart guy, that's for sure. It seems to be a natural consequence of our points of view to assume that the whole of space is filled with electrons and flying electric ions of all kinds. A very few lonely pioneers make their way to high places never before visited. They create the living conditions of mankind, and the majority are living on their work. Kristian Birkland. Electromagnetic cannon. The scale of Birkland's research enterprises was such that the time-honored matter of funding became an overwhelming obstacle. Recognizing that technological invention could bring wealth, he developed an electromagnetic cannon in 1900. He obtained patents on what we now call an electromagnetic coil gun and, with some investors, formed a firearms company. The coil gun worked, except the high muzzle velocities he predicted, 600 meters per second, were not produced. The most he could get from his largest machine was 100 meters per second, corresponding to a disappointing projectile range of only 1 kilometer. So he renamed the device an aerial torpedo and arranged a demonstration with the express aim of selling the company. At the demonstration, one of the coils shorted and produced a sensational inductive arc, complete with noise, flame, and smoke. This was the first failure of any of the launchers that Birkland had built. It could easily have been repaired and another demonstration organized. However, fate intervened in the form of an engineer named Sam Eade. At a dinner party only 1 week later, Eade told Birkland that there was an industrial need for the biggest flash of lightning that can be brought down to Earth in order to make artificial fertilizer. Birkland's climactic reply was, "I have it." There were no more attempts to sell the firearms company. He worked with Eade only long enough to build a plasma arc device for the nitrogen fixation process. The pair worked to develop the prototype furnace into a design that was economically viable for large-scale manufacture. Birkland then enjoyed adequate funding for his only real interest, research. The fact that Birkland joined with Eade as a business partner appears to have been one of the reasons why Birkland was unsuccessful in being awarded the Nobel Prize for his idea. Eade wanted to be nominated along with Birkland. However, the Nobel Prize is designed to recognize the original idea, not any commercial applications. This resulted in a possibly contentious nomination, and this combined with the fact that at that time relations between Sweden and Norway were delicate, meant that he wasn't nominated by the committee. Investigating the aurora. After encouragement from his math teacher, encouraged, Birkland bought a bar magnetic and read about William Gilbert's 1544 to 1603 study of Earth's magnetism and his Torella made from naturally magnetized lodestone. Of course, lodestone is where the word magnetism came from, because it was by Magnese. Gilbert surmised that the Earth was like a bar magnet whose magnetism was somehow related to electricity. He organized several expeditions to Norway's high latitude regions, where he established a network of observatories under the auroral regions to collect magnetic field data. The results of the Norwegian polar expedition, conducted from 1899 to 1900, contained the first determination of the global pattern of electric currents in the polar region from ground magnetic field measurements. The discovery of X-rays inspired Birkland to develop vacuum chambers to study the influence of magnets on cathode rays. An example of one of his experiments is depicted on the left front of the banknote. It shows a magnetized Torella simulating the Earth, suspended in an evacuated box. Birkland noticed that an electron beam directed toward the Torella was guided toward the magnetic poles and produced rings of light around the poles, and concluded that the aurora could be produced in a similar way. He developed a theory in which energetic electrons were ejected from sunspots on the solar surface, directed to the Earth, and guided to the Earth's polar regions by the geomagnetic field, where they produced the visible aurora. Birkland was nominated for the Nobel Prize no less than 7 times. Birkland's Torella showing a spiral form. On possible electric phenomena in solar systems and nebulae. So he wrote a book, okay. The Sun. The series of experiments that I have made with a magnetic globe as cathode in a large vacuum box for the purpose of studying analogies to the zodiacal light and Saturn's ring have led to discoveries that appear to be of great importance for the solar theory. We have already several times had occasion to give various particulars regarding the manner in which these experiments were carried out. It is by powerful magnetization of the magnetizable globe that phenomena answering to Saturn's rings is produced. During this process, polar radiation and disruptive discharges at the equator, which happens to be a unipolar discharge, may also occur. If the current intensity of discharge is great, if the magnetization of the globe be reduced, or the tension of the discharge increased gradually, the luminous ring round the globe will be reduced to a minimum size, after which another equatorial ring is developed and expands rapidly. It has been possible for the ring to develop in such a manner that it could easily be demonstrated by radiation on the most distant wall of my large vacuum tube. The corresponding ring would then have a diameter of 70 centimeters, while the diameter of the globe was 8 centimeters. It is a corresponding primary ring of radiant matter about the Sun that, in my opinion, can give an efficient explanation to the various zodiacal light phenomena. In the above-mentioned experiments, it is seen how the rays from the polar regions bend down in a simple curve about the equatorial plane of the globe, to continue their course outwards from the globe in the vicinity of this plane. An auroral is hereby produced about the magnetic globe, with ray structure at the poles. The whole thing strongly resembling pictures of the Sun's corona. Rarefied gases rendering luminous by similar discharges from the Sun would first emit a light of their own, and then diffuse that of the Sun. It is well known that the spectrum of the corona contains above all a brilliant ray of coronium.
Coronium.
And besides this, there is a faint continuous spectrum, probably due to reflected solar light. If the sun's corona is of an electric origin, such as we have here assumed, we might perhaps expect to see an enormous ring of light about the sun every time the Earth, during an eclipse of the sun, stood very nearly in the plane of the sun's equator. This would have to be upon the assumption that in the spaces far from the sun there is a gas that can become electrically luminescent, or in an electric state able to reflect sunlight. It is possible to believe, however, that the sun's chromosphere, which is a sharply defined envelope of hydrogen, is again surrounded by an envelope of coronium of almost limitless extent. Analogies from the Earth's atmosphere, whose nature has been made clearer through the latest researches of Hahn, H-A-N-N, Humphrey, and Wagner, seem at any rate to indicate that the above-mentioned assumption is probable. Wagner has recently shown that there must be new fundamental layer limits in the Earth's atmosphere, above a covering of hydrogen, which prevails from a height of 75 to 200 kilometers. A new gas is to be found, which he calls geocoronium, extending up to such heights that the steady auroral arcs, for instance, that are observed as much as 600 kilometers above the Earth would be due to electric luminescence in this gas. We will now pass on to experiments that, in my opinion, have brought about the most important discoveries in the long chain of experimental analogies to terrestrial and cosmic phenomena that I have produced. In the experiments represented in figures 248A and E, there are some small white patches on the globe, which are due to a kind of discharge that, under ordinary circumstances, is disruptive and which radiates from points on the cathode. If the globe has a smooth surface and is not magnetized, the disruptive discharges come rapidly, one after another, and are distributed more or less uniformly all over the globe. On the other hand, if the globe is magnetized, even very slightly, the patches from which the disruptive discharges issue arrange themselves then in two zones parallel with the magnetic equator of the globe, and the more powerfully the globe is magnetized, the nearer do they come to the equator. With a constant magnetization, the zones of patches will be found near the equator if the discharge tension is low, but far from the equator if the tension is high. The pressure of the gas is very small during these discharges. The patches, a narrow pencil of cathode rays so intense that the gas is illuminated all along the pencil up to the wall of the tube. This splendid phenomenon recalls our hypothesis, according to which sunspots sometimes send out into space long pencils of cathode rays. Schuster has recently made some serious objections to the hypothesis that sunspots emit direct, rather well-defined pencils of cathode rays, a hypothesis which was put forward by me in 1899 and 1900 and by Maunder in 1904, The Origin of Magnetic Storms. Schuster considers that the velocity of such cathode particles as they sweep past the Earth is reduced to about 9 kilometers per second. It is otherwise with the more refined form in which the theory has been presented by Professor Birkland, who qualitatively, at any rate, has shown that an agreement might be reached if we can imagine the particles to be drawn in towards the Earth by its magnetic forces, so that for the time being their motion is regulated by the position of Earth's magnetic poles. Nevertheless, the argument from energy and from electrostatic considerations alike has now been shown to be fatal to the theory in any form. Schuster considers that the velocity of such cathode particles as they swept past the Earth is reduced to about 9 kilometers per second, and that the passage between the Sun and the Earth would take about a year, so that the magnetic effects of such rays could not reproduce even roughly, the characteristic features of a magnetic disturbance. He does, it is true, say at the conclusion of his paper. I do not think, however, that Schuster's objections have any serious bearing on my theory. If we consider the properties which the new sunbeams must be assumed to possess, I have shown that cathode rays from the sun, which are to strike down towards the Earth in the aurora polaris zones, must have a transversal mass about m equals 1.83 times 10 to the third. In other words, the longitudinal mass of our particles is 6 milliard times greater than the mass of the particles upon which Schuster calculates in his energy comments. Thus, these cathode rays will pass the Earth, not with a velocity of 9 kilometers, but with a velocity very little short of that of light. Birkland organized several expeditions to Norway's high-latitude regions, where he established a network of observatories under the auroral region to collect magnetic field data. The results of the Norwegian polar expedition, conducted from 1899 to 1900, contained the first determination of the global pattern of electric currents in the polar region from ground magnetic field measurements. The discovery of X-rays inspired Birkland to develop vacuum chambers to study the influence of magnets on cathode rays. Birkland noticed that an electron beam directed toward a magnetized torella was guided toward the magnetic poles and produced rings of light around the poles, and concluded that the aurora could be produced in a similar way. He developed a theory in which energetic electrons were ejected from sunspots on the solar surface, directed to the Earth and guided to the Earth's polar regions by the geomagnetic field, where they produced the visible aurora. This is essentially the theory of the aurora today. Birkland proposed in 1908 in his book, The Norwegian Aurora Polaris Expedition 1902-1903, that polar electric currents, today referred to as auroral electrojet, were connected to a system of currents that flowed along geomagnetic field lines into and away from the polar region. Such field-aligned currents are known today as Birkland currents in his honor. He provided on the 1902-1903 expedition contains chapters on magnetic storms on the Earth and their relationship to the Sun, the origin of the Sun itself, Halley's Comet, and the rings of Saturn. Birkland's vision of what are now known as Birkland currents became the source of a controversy that continued for over a half-century. Because their existence could not be confirmed from ground-based measurements alone, his theory was disputed and ridiculed at the time as a fringe theory by mainstream scientists, most notoriously by the eminent British geophysicist, mathematician, hoity-toity Sidney Chapman, who argued the mainstream view that currents could not cross the vacuum of space, and therefore the currents had to be generated by the Earth. Birkland's theory of the aurora continued to be dismissed by the mainstream, astrophysicists. After his death in 1917, it was notably championed by the Swedish plasma scientist Hans Elfvén. Go Hans! But Elfvén's work, in turn, was also disputed by Chapman. Because he's the big root fuck heap.
He's one of them guys that looks like they're always smelling poo.
Proof of Birkland's theory, they don't have to be wrong or right when they get to that status. They're God. Proof of Birkland's theory, I don't think they could handle it if they found out they were wrong. They'd be like the Boston Strangler at the end of the movie, when everybody was talking to him and he just stood there staring straight ahead. He wouldn't be able to handle it. Tony Curtis, you'd have to be able to see that movie. Okay. Swedish plasma scientist Hans Elfvén was disputed by Chapman. Proof of Birkland's theory of the aurora only came in 1967 after a probe was sent into space. The crucial results were obtained from the U.S. Navy satellite 1963 38C, launched in 1963, carrying a magnetometer above the ionosphere. Magnetic disturbances were observed on nearly every pass over the high latitude regions of the Earth. So there he got his revenge, but old Sidney went to his grave thinking he was right. Well, hoping he was right, but really deep down inside he had to know he was wrong, if he had any intelligence at all. But those people, their egos are so big. It's just hard for me to fathom, really. You would think they'd want to know the truth, but that's not the way they are. It's just ridiculous. It's a little insane to think about it. Oh well, I'll stop blabbing. When it comes down to the end, he was just another insecure little man who stood in the way of true progress. It's happened so many times we lost count. Birkland was born in Kristiania, Oslo, today, Norway. Wrote his first scientific paper at the age of 18. Birkland married Ida Charlotte Hammer in 1905. They had no children. Due to Birkland's preoccupation with his work, they divorced in 1911. He was a man on a mission, one of those people. Suffering from severe paranoia due to his use of Veronal as a sleeping aid, he died under mysterious circumstances in his room in the Hotel Seiyokan in Tokyo while visiting colleagues at the University of Tokyo. A post-mortem revealed that Birkland had taken 10 grams of Veronal the night he died, instead of 0.5 recommended dose. The time of death was estimated at 7 a.m. on 15th of June 1917. Some authors have claimed that he committed suicide. On the nightstand lay a revolver. Often geniuses can't sleep. They're insomniacs. And I don't know what that Veronal is, but I have to take a sleep aid. I'm not saying I'm a genius, but there are a lot of people that have sleeping problems. I think probably a lot of it with him had to do with the way he was done, just dirty by mainstream establishment science. Can you imagine if they would have got Birkland and Tesla together in the same room, what they could have done? These were the two leading scientists of the early 20th century, if you ask me.
They basically used the paranormal stuff to stretch the credulity of the German public so they would accept the big lies. And it's being used here the same way because the same people basically instigated it in this country after the war. And so they basically created the whole UFO field as to number one, to cover up the UFO secrets. Number two, to stretch the credulity by talking about aliens. Basically what this does is this swallows a big hole in the credulity of the average person so that they will believe anything the government tells them. And this has been the whole idea. And I'm a little encouraged by the fact that people are starting to question the government more and more every day, and I think it's about time. But it goes much further beyond what people suspect.
Right.
They don't realize that the science books have been distorted and so forth. So they're actually teaching kids scientific garbage, in many respects. But
yeah, I don't doubt that at all. It's if we look at the whole field of education overall, it's going down the tubes. But has there been kind of, as you see it, then a battle of different directions that the scientific field could have taken, but again they've avoided it? I mean, again, there seems to be a split really in the early 1900s.
Yeah, the dissenters have basically been overpowered, of course, by the unlimited money and propaganda of the government because, people like J.P. Morgan, he took over, he had a monopoly of communications. He owned not only the telephone, distribution and power distribution, but he also owned all the radio stations and banks and so forth. So they basically, what I call physics is popular physics is basically stuff that real physicists don't really pay any attention to that stuff. They don't use relativism in their scientific processes.